Joining me in the studio is Dan Petrie, Chief Information Officer at Grafa. Grafa crunches large amounts of data to produce results. First of all, is Gladys Berejiklian right? Are we that connected in Australia? Are the states connected?
Absolutely, Steve. I was thinking...
So our fate is tied up with each other?
Absolutely. I mean, I was actually thinking back, it would have been when you were actually probably a young teenager getting around Queensland and myself, but we no longer have Chandlers. The electronic store. We are a national economy. We've got broad national bans. We don't have IG supermarkets the same way we did 30 years ago. And the simple fact is Gladys Berejiklian, I'm not trying to be too party political here, but she's acting in the national interest. And the Premier, sadly, is not. And the other thing too is...
the Premier's office has made it quite clear it's not about the national interest, it's about Queensland. I won the election. The election was a vote on my border policy. I'm not budging.
Then secede then. Raise your own taxes and revenues. And I mean, this is the thing, at the same time, you can't keep saying, the federal government can pick up the bill for JobKeeper, but we're going to insist on a whole bunch of onerous, restrictions. And look, the other thing too is, the regions which are being hurt by this are the tourism sector, which the government says, we're doing everything we can to, unite and recover. Well, how about nationally we unite and recover? Because the simple fact is you've decimated the travel industry. You've got, the likes of Graham Turner who's come out, Alan Joyce have come out, and the simple fact is for a long time we've maintained a hard border when there's been no active cases between northern Sydney and the New South Wales border. Now, I've driven that road many, many times in my life, and it is a massive distance. And it's bloody-mindedness for the sake of it. And again, while there's politics at play here, the simple fact is you've got businesses, many of whom are going to the wall, and they are the headlines which don't get seen. And we need to be very pragmatic and sensible about what we're confronting here.
We have restricted international trade. We've got no international tourism visitors coming in, no backpackers coming in to pick our fruit and our food. Jean Tunney, who's a former Commonwealth Treasury official, has said specifically in relation to Queensland's position that we should be assessing the remaining border restrictions weekly, not monthly, as we're currently doing. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously, Jean and I talk a lot of weeks on these particular matters, but we're talking about an arbitrary border, particularly in the case of the Coolangatta Tweed, where it's through it like a population centre. Now, the Gold Coast is the 6th largest city in Australia. And when you start cutting that off in terms of, it's also a big magnet now for international students, they're gone for next year if we don't actually change the border restrictions. We're talking about the conference industry, gone for next year, 2021. You heard the New South Wales Premier then talking about the June quarter next year. When we talk about the economy, often when the GDP print comes out, it's a backward-looking number. But the thing which worries the Treasury boffins the most is the actual, what's going to look like over the next 12 to 24 months, the near term, within the business cycle. We're at the start of a new business cycle and we're being smashed. And recovering from that unite and recover thing, once a business is gone, it takes a very, very long to get that lead time to go again.
Now, Brisbane people aren't feeling the pain. Now, so who cares if tourism on the Gold Coast is doing it tough? Brisbane people aren't feeling that pain.
Well, eventually, Steve, eventually it's like a string of dynamite. Enough gunpowder, eventually it blows up. Okay, when enough money stops circulating in the economy, eventually it blows up. Now, Brisbane people, for example, if someone's working in the public service, you do need taxation receipts and they need to come from profitable businesses. If those businesses are no longer profitable, they're gone. Now, on the Gold Coast, for example, 80,000 businesses on the Gold Coast, 170, 180,000 in Brisbane. So you've got a situation where you've got 2 businesses for every person living on the coast, 3 in fact, for every business here in Brisbane.
Per capita, there's actually more businesses on the Gold Coast than there is in Brisbane.
Yes, that's correct.
Per capita.
And it's also a diversifying economy. I think the last read, its gross regional product now is about $40 billion. Like, that's gone up a staggering amount in the space of 10 years. It's a big magnet in terms of not just education, but light manufacturing. If we want to attract investment here too, you can't just have this bloody-minded approach to it.
Well, the Premier's position, and she hasn't said this, but I'm interpreting this as not my problem, that's a federal government problem. Job seeker, job keeper, job maker, it's their federal programs, they pay the bill, that's their issue.
Well, but at some point, we're all part of federation. You've got businesses which do, businesses in Queensland which service businesses in New South Wales and Victoria. You've got skills and which are, go across borders. Like the Brisbane-Sydney airport route, for example, is one of the busiest. It's in the top 20 in the world. The Melbourne-Sydney airport route, that route alone is the 4th busiest in the world. We're an interconnected federation.
My guest is Dan Petrie. Dan Petrie is the Chief Information Officer at Grafa. They're a data analytics firm. He used to work at Bloomberg a number of years ago. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Austin's my name. So what does this mean for Queensland's GST take and payroll receipts if there's less business activity within Queensland? In other words, the borders are shut, so people are spending money here. What does it mean for our GST take, which goes to Queensland Treasury through the grants process, or payroll receipts from business?
Well, remember, that's a formulation, that's a calculation done federally through the Grants Commission too. So, Cameron Dick has already indicated that that's going to be down by about $2 billion. So just for listeners, the GST take makes up just under half of the state's revenues. That's the public revenues. And, of course, when you add in the non-public bits, it's a bit more. It's a bit less, sorry. But in terms of the GST, that's down by a couple of billion. Your payroll tax, so you've got these things on JobKeeper and job seekers, payroll tax is effectively gone. Not, payroll tax in any given measure is about $6.5 billion a year. So it's about 10% of revenues. Now, already that's going to take a significant hit. We don't know how much, but again, I wouldn't put a figure on it in the absence of seeing, some proper figures from Treasury. But that's going to be a significant hit. So you've got these two core areas. The only area which will probably offset that is probably some stamp duty revenue, which is coming from a property sector where people are either selling or they're trying to bring in some buyers, and they're typically coming from the southern states. But you've also got, this is one thing which is the bit of the canary in the coal mine, you've got the coking coal price, that hard coking coal price. Now, Treasury's estimated it's around 140, 150 US bucks per metric tonne. It's currently hovering about 110, 112.
So it's a third of what it was.
Correct. And it was actually $200, US only a year ago. But there's actually no supply-demand dynamic where that's concerned. The reason the metallurgical coal price has been elevated for the last 5 years was back in 2016, the Chinese said, we're going to cut the number of working days for our coal mines. China was a net exporter of coal only up until 2010. And since then, the met price has been really affected by a reduction in working days in China. It's got nothing to do with, this huge demand for met coal. It's more to do with the fact that that's what the Chinese did. All
right. I have no doubt my listener will be saying, I don't care. The Premier's keeping me safe. I want to be healthy. You can't have an economy without being healthy.
You can't live without a job either. That's what I'd also say to your listeners. And so, you need to, you don't have to have a zero-sum game where you're choosing here, but you do have to be somewhat pragmatic about the fact that, Australia's the magic ingredient which has always made this state, so prosperous as being a low tax, easy to understand. It's built on economic activity. It's built on visitor numbers. It's built on exports. If we cut that off, eventually the piper comes, to collect. And if the state's got no revenue, it has to make very, very tough decisions. And that is just a fundamental reality of what we face.
The intra-state migration rate to Queensland is currently very high. People are getting out of Victoria again and coming to Queensland. I forget what the figure is, but won't this cushion the impact? I mean, the mere fact that people are leaving Victoria and moving to Queensland, settling on the Sunshine Coast somewhere, won't that actually cushion the impact?
Yeah, but at some point they've also have jobs, like in the Sunshine, you can move to the Sunshine Coast, you can buy your pile or wherever it is, but you do need to, you can't necessarily live off investments if the investments, let's say an ASX companies aren't producing any revenue. Eventually those dividends get cut. You need the activity in the economy to keep going, and you can buy a house up here and it will, elevate coffers around stamp duty, but the simple fact is, for the government then, there's another cause to build more infrastructure. And if you look at the run rate of infrastructure build, they love to announce it. High-vis was what we saw throughout the election. But the actual run rate of construction has been running at decade lows, and not just in this decade, but well over 15 years now.
So what happens if Queensland doesn't move before December 1st, which is what the Premier's office is telling us? No decision to be made until National Cabinet, 2 weeks away, end of the month.
Well, it'll decimate the Christmas retail trade for...
What, 2 weeks?
Well, that's basically where a large part of retail businesses, you talk to Paul Zara from the National Retailers Association, he'll tell you the same thing. A lot of businesses, their strategy is to collect big during Christmas, and it's really a case of fattening up like a bear so you can actually endure the lean months in the following year. If you don't have that Christmas trade, a lot of businesses will simply go to the wall. And then I don't need to remind listeners that Queensland holds the unenviable record of having one of the highest bankruptcy rates, not just by number, but anywhere in the country. So it is a concern.
So what's Cameron Dick going to do then? He's preparing a state budget as we speak. He's got to deliver it within 2 to 3 weeks and tell Queenslanders how much money we've got. And they've got to deliver their promises.
I'd submit that the Treasurer would be thanking Governor Lowe every day from the Reserve Bank of Australia.
Philip Lowe.
Yeah, because, the simple fact, they've expanded their balance sheet by the tune of $300 billion. That's what they're talking, and that's a gigantic quantum they've cut to 0.1%. So on $100,000, you're lucky to get, you're lucky to get $100 for that if you're a saver, But the fact is, that's what they're going to buy state government debt, and the state government will be, afforded the luxury, really, of being able to kick the can down the road. Now, that is going back. You mentioned the fact I worked at Bloomberg. One of the things I remember spending a lot of time on was Greece, the numbers there. And, their bond situation wasn't that terrible 18 months before everything blew up, and then Germany dialed up the heat. It only takes one thing. It's like you do get like a flick in the coal mine, and eventually you have to confront these things.
So Australia, the Australian Federation, is saving Queensland, but Queensland's saying, well, it doesn't really matter because you're paying our bills. We're going to keep the border shut anyhow.
We can suppression was the strategy which everyone signed up to, not eradication. We're in an environment where, we talk about this virus. I'm not trying to discount the seriousness of it, but you have to look at what some of the preeminent epidemiologists, I'll probably pronounce it incorrectly, but Professor Paul Kelly, for example, said there's no logical reason to keep state borders shut. We've got this situation where you've got every state with a contact tracing team, and some are doing better than others. Why weren't we doing that from a federal perspective? It makes no sense.
My guest is Dan Petrie, Chief Information Officer at Grafa. They crunch data on markets and analytics. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. So Queensland is facing reduced GST take. So we won't get the money out of the federal government for that through the grants process. Reduced money for payroll, but we may get a bit of a lift in terms of the Victorians moving here in terms of stamp duty, but that's about it.
That would be the pencils I'd be putting around at the moment. And the other thing too is I spend a lot of time every morning. The coking coal price tends to kind of be what I go to bed and wake up with.
And the coking coal price is not plummeting, but reducing dramatically.
It's certainly moderating. There's a glut of steel globally. And there is, you can't discount the China trade tension at the moment, but there is a glut of steel. But the one thing, that area, which we talk about up in Moranbah, that counts for roughly about half the world's met coal production. And most of it, there's China factors into it, but a lot of it goes to Japan. And so we have to look at the situation there. They've had to kick their Olympics back a year, and whether that goes ahead remains to be seen. So it's still it's going to be a very, very tough budget for the Treasurer to deliver. But I would say just on the broad thematics of it, we do need pragmatism. We can't have we cannot have another year what we've just had.
Now, usually state budgets make people's eyes glaze over in monotonous boredom, but this one will be very interesting. What should we look out for in the figures of the state budget, which Cameron Dick, Treasurer, is putting together now, should deliver in 2 to 3 weeks? What should we look for?
Well, there's going to be. He'll have to obviously answer the inevitable question about the number of public servants and consultants that the government employs, and there's not really much they can do. I think 90% of the equivalent is frontline workers, so they'll have to basically make a case around the level of contractors and consultants they use. That's going to be an obvious point. That headline figures around $26 billion for states' public servants. The key thing will be the outlays around the infrastructure spend. Because Jackie Trade, when she was Treasurer, highlighted this huge number, but it really is the culmination of a lot of years in the planning. So getting those shovels in the ground will have to come forward rather aggressively. And so they are in a position where they can borrow quite. Well,
they've already said they're going to borrow $4 billion.
Well, they might have to elevate that just because you're now in a situation where every government around the country has to support demand in the economy. If they don't, and then there's the fallout of supporting people who have lost work, and also the small businesses on the coast. They can't endure another season like we've just had.
Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Dan Petrie, Chief Information Officer at Grafa.